Well, hello everybody, and a happy Monday to you. It's the old skipper here, and we're excited to bring you another episode of historical information about North America and how we Canadians didn't have such a peaceful time of it, especially during the time when we were still part of the British colonies. I especially like this episode because we're talking about the disaster of Fort William Henry. The interesting thing about this little piece is if you've ever watched The Last of the Mohicans and Chinook, I grew up with that. This really covers that period of time and what went on. And I certainly I'm looking forward to taking a look at what this wonderful content creator has done. He's done a marvelous job of presenting us with some really interesting facts about what went on at Fort William Henry. So I really do hope that you enjoy it. I'm seeing some good friends in the chat here. We'll take a quick look, and we've got Tupac from Coining Around. Nice to see you. Hopefully we'll get a few more people in to take a look at the video today. But and of course, Kyle's here. And wonderful to see you here. I know Kyle likes history as well, so we're going to really enjoy covering this period of time. So without too much ado, what I'll do is I'm going to put an invite up. I'll give a couple of seconds up. If you folks want to come up and join me, you're more than welcome. We'll sit back, watch the video, and anytime that anybody wants to interject and want to comment on it, they certainly can. This is a learning venture, and hopefully you'll get something really important out of the video. It's an eye-opener, to say the least. So here we go. Here we're going to bring it up.
Fort William Henry, perched at the southern tip of Lake George, the frontier between the British colonies and New France. During the French and Indian War, it was subject to a siege and an infamous massacre that followed. Events that inspired James Fenimore Cooper's American classic, The Last of the Mohicans. The French army bombarded the fort with artillery, while their Indian allies surrounded the encampment to the southeast. The British held out for as long as they could, sending repeated requests for reinforcements from Fort Edward, just 16 miles to the south. After several days and nights under heavy fire from French cannons, the future of the fort looked grim. The myth of Fort William Henry has grown stronger with time, exaggeration and fiction prevailing over the truth. More than 250 years later, journals and letters from men on both sides of the conflict recount the events. Hear the story from the men who lived through it. Fort William Henry was built in a time of turmoil. British and French colonies had been fighting for control of North America in a series of wars that lasted almost 100 years. The fort stood for less than 2 years during the last of these wars, a war which decided the direction of European colonialism on the continent.
This war, the expulsion of the French, fundamentally changed the imperial makeup of North America.
In the mid-18th century, France claimed a large arc of land across North America. It stretched from the Atlantic seaboard along the St. Lawrence River to the Great Lakes and south down the Mississippi River Valley to New Orleans. Most of New France was sparsely populated, the only signs of occupation being isolated forts that supported France's fur trade with various groups of American Indians. Estimates put the population of New France at about 75,000. In contrast, over 1 million people populated the 13 British colonies that stretched along the east coast of North America. This disparity in population meant the French relied heavily on alliances with American Indians when conflict arose with the British.
Most native people preferred the French to the British. The French were not aggressive colonizers of land. They generally would establish a fort someplace, and traders and diplomats and missionaries would kind of fan out from there. But they didn't take huge portions of land and clear cut the forest and build farms and push native people out. They kind of brought native people in as allies. So native people preferred that for very obvious reasons.
The early 1750s saw several years of uneasy peace between the two European nations. In 1754, this peace came to an end. Land disputes over the Ohio River Valley led to several small skirmishes between the French and British colonials.
When the English advanced to establish the trading post at the forks of the Ohio, the French took that as trespassing on land that they had claimed. They sent a small armed force to remove those people.
The hostilities quickly escalated, resulting in major British losses and marking the beginning of the French and Indian War. The following year, the British response for their losses was a multi-pronged attack on several French forts. Major General William Johnson, agent to the Iroquois Indians, was tasked with mounting the attack on Fort St. Frederick, a French fort at Crown Point on Lake Champlain, a strategic location in the New York frontier.
You know, the corridor formed by the Hudson River, Lake Champlain, and the Richelieu River into the St. Lawrence, that's the most direct route between the French colonies in Canada and the English colonies in southern North America.
With a few short portages, passage from New York City in the south all the way to Montreal in the north was possible. An army commanding these water routes could travel freely and control the continent. In the summer, William Johnson moved north from Albany along a newly cut road. With him were 1,500 provincials and his Mohawk allies.
So many don't know
He
this.
stopped briefly about 50 miles north at the Great Carrying Place, the portage connecting the Hudson River and the lakes to the north. Here, construction of Fort Edward began.
Captain Eyre has laid out a position of fortification here around Lydius's log house, which, if finished, would be very serviceable in case of a retreat.
Johnson chose his route north toward Fort St. Frederick and moved onward. On the 28th of August, he arrived at the southern end of Lac du Saint-Sacrement, which he audaciously renamed.
This lake called St. Sacrament by the French, I have called Lake George, not only in honor of His Majesty, but to ascertain his dominion here.
Johnson put his men to work clearing the land and establishing a foothold in the region.
I arrived here with about 1,500 men the 28th in the evening. All was thick wood, not a foot of land cleared. Our time since has been chiefly spent in opening the ground about us and forming some regular kind of encampment.
Indian scouts saw Johnson's movements and told the French at Fort St. Frederick. The French troops, under the command of Baron Dieskau, prepared to counter the British threat. The following day, they marched up Johnson's newly built road toward Lake George. Johnson sent a party of men from the Massachusetts Regiment along with Mohawk allies to intercept them.
The 1,000 men were detached under the command of Colonel Williams of one of the Boston regiments with upwards of 200 Indians. They marched between 8 and 9 o'clock. In about an hour and a half afterwards, we heard heavy firing and all the marks of a warm engagement.
The Colonials and Mohawk walked straight into an ambush. The French forces had formed a hook, hoping to engulf the whole of the English column in musket fire. Luckily for the British, the Canadians and Indians on the ridge fired prematurely, making the French regulars mostly ineffective in the ambush. A group of the British Colonials and Mohawk covered the fleeing and wounded with a firing retreat. The French forces advanced in pursuit, but most were able to escape what has since been called the Bloody Morning Scout. When the troops at Lake George heard the repeated musket fire drawing closer, they quickly prepared for an attack. Johnson ordered boats brought up from the lake and wagons overturned to create an improvised breastwork for the encampment. As the French approached Lake George, Dieskau ordered the regulars to rush up the lake road. He hoped they would draw the bulk of the fire, allowing the Indians and Canadians to flank the encampment. Once the French regulars were out in the open, cannon and musket fire erupted from the camp.
The French regulars kept their ground and order for some time with great resolution and good conduct, but the warm and constant fire from our artillery and troops put them into disorder.
As the French regulars were cut down, Canadians and Indians fired from the cover of the forest, but were unable to take the encampment. Ultimately, both Johnson and Dieskau suffered wounds, with the French generals being much more serious.
About 4 o'clock, our men and the Indians jumped over the breastwork, pursued the enemy in slaughtered numbers and took several prisoners, amongst whom is the Baron de Dieskau, the French general of all the regular forces.
Seeing their commander fall, the Canadians and their Indian allies retreated. By conventional accounts, the British colonials had achieved victory at the Battle of Lake George. They held their encampment and captured the enemy commander.
The Battle of Lake George was really the first time that you'll see an army of provincial forces actually defeat a well-trained, well-disciplined European fighting force. And it is these same young men that will later become prominent officers and such during the American Revolution. But this will be their first time they're really tested.
The cost of victory, however, was great. Both sides lost several hundred men.
I sent a party to bury our dead this afternoon. It being a running scattered engagement, we can neither find all our dead nor give an exact account.
Johnson's men were wounded and weary from the battle. Rather than pursue the French or continue with the expedition against Crown Point, they chose to better fortify the position at Lake George.
We have fixed on a spot for a fort. It is clearing and near 400 men employed, who, I hope in a few days, will have a fort in great forwardness, and that it will be put into a respectable condition before the army leaves this place.
The axes of both armies were busy that fall. As work progressed on Fort William Henry, the French were diligently constructing Fort Carillon at the north end of the lake. In mid-November of 1755, the flag was raised over Fort William Henry. Fort William Henry had an irregular square shape, with the west wall longer than the rest. Each side was almost 300 feet in length, with bastions at the four corners allowing defensive fire in several directions. The east, west, and south walls were protected by a dry moat, while the ground outside the northern wall sloped down to the lake. East of the fort was a swamp area, which acted as an additional obstacle for any attackers. Inside the fort were barracks 2 stories high, a magazine, and a hospital.
It was a significant fort.
The barracks of Fort William Henry could house between 400 and 500 men. Additional troops were housed in an encampment to the west of the fort. The following year saw an official declaration of war between England and France. The French and Indian War was now part of a larger global conflict known as the 7 Years' War. Fighting spanned across Europe to India, Africa, and the Americas. Both nations sent regular troops to America to fight in the escalating conflict. Changes in command also took place this year.
One of the consequences of the English victory at Lake George was the wounding and capturing of the French commanding officer. With that vacancy, the French king had to put somebody else in command, and so he sent reinforcements and a new field commander, the Marquis de Montcalm.
The previous year's losses also forced the British to appoint a new commander. They chose John Campbell, the 4th Earl of...
Now, just to point out, when me mentioned Montcalm, that's the same Montcalm that was defeated on the Plains of Abraham by General Wolfe.
of Loudon as Commander-in-Chief of North American forces. Lord Loudon did not arrive in North America until July. In the interim, Major General Daniel Webb was charged with securing the New York frontier. Webb slowly moved up the Mohawk River to resupply and reinforce forts to the west. In contrast, General Montcalm moved quickly. In August of 1756, his army set their sights on Oswego, a gathering of British forts on Lake Ontario. On August 11th, the French attack began. For 3 days, the British defended Oswego, but the French forces were too much.
The English didn't put up much of a fight, and the commanding officer literally lost his head to a French cannonball. That caused such a great effect on the English garrison that they surrendered almost immediately.
Montcalm won a decisive victory. His men seized the artillery, while their Indian allies entered the fort to plunder. The fall of Oswego was devastating for the British. It was the latest in a series of losses since the war had begun.
One of the greatest impacts for the French was that word spread among the Indian nations that the French were powerful. They were able to defeat the English, and so that heightened their reputation among the Indians.
The news of the taking of Oswego created a sensation in the Western country. A great number of Indians appeared full of ardor to come next season and hit the English.
Back at Lake George, news of the attack on Oswego put the troops at both ends of the lake on alert. Montcalm hurriedly returned to the New York frontier. He ordered a new encampment on the Lachute River to secure the portage between Lake Champlain and George. This location could both slow a British advance and be a staging ground for future attacks into the New York colony. At Fort William Henry, the British focused their efforts on gathering information about the French forts to the north. This task proved difficult. The Indian allies of New France acted as both scouts and a protective screen against the British Ranger companies sent to gather intelligence.
In the woods of America, one can no more do without them than without cavalry in open country.
As the year came to a close, all major activities ceased. Montcalm returned to Montreal, where he reflected on the French victories and turned his attention to securing the Lake Champlain region the following year.
The various events of the 1756 campaign in North America will make it the brightest campaign there has ever been on this continent.
In the late winter, the governor of Canada, the Marquis de Vaudreuil, planned an attack against Fort William Henry. His brother, Francois Pierre de Rigaud, led almost 1,600 French regulars, Canadians, and Native Americans down the frozen Lake Champlain.
Interestingly enough, they had quite a wide variety of weather to experience before they even got to Ticonderoga. Ice on Lake Champlain softened from warm weather. It rained, it snowed. There were some days where there was 5 to 6 inches of water on the ice that was soaking their supplies that they were pulling behind themselves in sleds.
The French forces arrived at the south end of Lake Champlain on March 5th, 1757. On the 15th, they left Carillon and began marching up the frozen Lake George.
They were so insecure on the condition of the ice of Lake George, probably based upon their experience of coming up Lake Champlain from Montreal, that each of the 3 columns of the French attacking force had men out in front with lanterns and hatchets testing the thickness of the ice.
In the early morning hours of March 19th, the sentries of the fort were alerted to the activity on the ice.
About 1 o'clock in the morning, a noise of axes was heard that seemed to be about 3 miles from the fort. This gave the alarm.
The French forces moved to attack, but were held off by the English. At daybreak, the French withdrew, waiting until nightfall to resume their attack. Under the cover of darkness, they began to set fire to the ships, bateaux, and buildings surrounding the fort.
These different fires burnt with such violence as to make one apprehend at one side of the fort that the other or opposite quarters were in flames. Yet, happily, by proper care and vigilance, no damage was done.
The battle continued in this manner for several days, coming to an end the night of March 22nd.
Such was the end of this expedition. They burned the enemy's 300 bateaux, 4 vessels, 2 houses, and left one other which they believed too exposed to burn.
The 44th Regiment had fought gallantly and to great effect. Major William Eyre reported only 7 wounded and no men killed, but they had lost almost all of their boats and stores. The winter garrison of Fort William Henry eagerly awaited relief. By April, the 35th Regiment of Foot, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Monroe, arrived to replace them. Throughout the spring and into the summer, Monroe and his men settled into their new accommodations.
Life at the fort was probably pretty rough. Journal descriptions see soldiers talking about how horrible things are at Fort William Henry.
A lot of modern concerns regarding sanitation and prevention of disease and things like that were not really known at the time, so that you could have a lot of sick people.
Horrible place.
The French were still intent on securing the New York frontier. Montcalm spent the late spring and early summer of 1757 building his army and recruiting Indian allies. The news of his success at Oswego had traveled far and greatly aided his efforts.
Canoe loads of Indians arrive every day. The number that come from the far west now passes 1,000. Some are from a nation so far away that no Canadian interpreter understands their language.
Throughout the first half of July, the French forces moved for Carillon. During June and July, General Webb at Fort Edward appeared almost indifferent to the French. He sent provincial troops and stores to Fort William Henry, but did not act with urgency, even as scouts repeatedly reported encounters.
The Mohawk Indians brought in a French prisoner taken at Crown Point. Monsieur Montcalm was coming and they had 6 battalions with 300 vessels and all the cannon taken at Ohio and Oswego.
At Fort William Henry, Lieutenant Colonel Monroe was eager for more information on the French movements. On July 22nd, he ordered Colonel John Parker, his regiment, the New Jersey Blues, and about 50 men from the New York Regiment on a reconnaissance mission down Lake George. By the end of the day, 300 men and more than 20 whaleboats had navigated through the small islands of the Narrows and camped for the night. Their presence on the lake did not go unnoticed. News of the British flotilla reached Carrion, and a party was sent to intercept them. The following morning, as the British whaleboats approached Sabbath Day Point, French allied Indians slipped canoes into the lake. By the time the British colonials realized the attack, it was too late.
The enemy no sooner saw them at hand than terror caused them even to drop their arms. It ceased to be a conflict and became only a flight. In an instant, they were seen pulling in the greatest haste for the bank, while some, to reach there sooner, threw themselves into the water for the purpose of swimming.
The Indians jumped into the water and speared them like fish. The English, terrified by the shooting, the sight, the cries, and the agility of these monsters, surrendered almost without firing a shot.
Only 4 of the whaleboats were able to escape. The Indians captured nearly 200 prisoners. The rest were drowned or killed.
The enemy referred to the disasters of that day in terms which mock equally their grief and surprise. They candidly acknowledged the greatness of their loss. It would have been difficult indeed to disprove it in the slightest.
This attack came to be called the Sabbath Day Point Massacre. The prisoners taken back to Carrion provided valuable information on the troops at Fort William Henry. These captives also caused problems for Montcalm. The Indians had learned from Oswego that the French would pay money for prisoners. After their victory on the 22nd, they had many prisoners and wanted to sell them to the French in Canada.
Many wanted to return to Montreal, saying that it would be tempting the Master of Life to expose yourself again to the hazard of war after such a great blow as the one they had just done.
The Europeans never really truly understood the Indian way of war, if you will. Their attitude was to control a conflict from start to finish and leave as quickly as possible with the spoils of war. Once they had achieved that objective, they were not interested in sitting in a camp for weeks on end waiting for logistical supplies to be built up enough so that they could participate with whatever the European objective might be.
Montcalm was able to persuade the Indians to stay. He provided them with receipts for their prisoners and sent the British captives to Montreal. On the 26th of July, Montcalm held a council at the Falls with all the chiefs of the different nations. He shared his plan for the attack and asked for their approval and participation.
The Marquis de Montcalm benefited by the chance fall of a great tree during the council. He referred to it as an omen of the fall of Fort George. Lamotte, Menominee chief, accepted the omen in the name of the Indians of the Far West.
The devastating attack at Sabbath Day Point prompted the British into action. General Webb, his chief engineer, and other officers left Fort Edward to inspect the defenses of Fort William Henry.
The Council of War came to several resolutions in respect to the defense of this place and traced out on the ground for a new camp.
It was determined to move the encampment to the location William Johnson had defended in 1755, southeast of the fort. This location was on higher ground. If the French were able to secure it, they could easily rain artillery down into the fort. Several other recommendations were made, including covering the magazine stores with sandbags, raising the east bastion 1 log, and signals between Forts William Henry and Edward. The men at the fort were put to work forming a hastily built breastwork of logs around the new encampment. It is not known how much of the remaining preparations were completed. General Webb returned to Fort Edward on July 30th. Upon his arrival, he sent dispatches to Albany requesting reinforcements. It seems that before visiting Fort William Henry, Webb had been completely unconcerned with the French threat. Now, he desperately called for more men to defend against the impending attack. Montcalm had assembled an army of 8,000 men, including 1,800 Indians from more than 30 nations. They carried with them over 40 pieces of artillery. Men worked day and night portaging the French army from Carillon to Lake George.
How
We
many
cannot understand what it takes to transport considerable artillery. 250 boats, food for 6 weeks for 10,000 men, all without horses nor oxen, with only the arms of men.
In the last days of July, almost 2,500 men, under the command of the Chevalier de Lévis, formed an advance guard. They set off on foot through the woods, led by 500 Indians, down the west side of Lake George. 2 days later, on August 1st, the remainder of the French army started up the lake.
The army embarked at 2 in the afternoon. Monsieur Jacot's boat was at the head of the fleet, made up of 250 sails. We stopped at 5 o'clock, 4 leagues from Carillon, where the Indians who left us yesterday and who waited for us took the lead in 150 birch-bark canoes. The sight was curious, even for a soldier accustomed to seeing European armies. Who can imagine the spectacle of 1,500 naked Indians in their canoes?
Early the following morning, the French flotilla joined the troops that traveled through the forest.
At 2 in the morning, the Marquis de Montcalm reached the Bay of Ganaouske, the rendezvous given to the land divisions. 3 fires lighted on the shore, which was the signal agreed upon, assured us that the Chevalier de Lévis was there.
The French had completed their first advancement up Lake George. Around noon, the Chevalier de Lévis again led the ground troops south through the woods to secure the next camp. At Fort William Henry, the men continued work on the new encampment. General Webb, meanwhile, sent troops from Fort Edward to reinforce the position on the lake.
About sunset, the main body arrived at the encampment, where General Johnson had the battle in 1755. When the whole had joined in camp and garrison, we made about 2,200 men fit for duty.
Later that night, a scouting party was sent out from the fort. 14 men in 2 whaleboats paddled down the lake, looking for signs of the enemy.
At 10 in the evening, 2 enemy barges approached the shore where the Indian canoes were gathered. Those who were within range made the customary cry and pursued the English.
About 10 at night, we heard a smart fire on the lake at about 4 miles distance. When we concluded, our guard boats were attacked. This gave us a suspicion of the enemy's approach.
Throughout the night, the men at Fort William Henry were making movements, preparing for an attack. The sentries were posted and alert. Indian scouts passed this information on to the French.
Consequently, the order of the march was doubled. The army set in motion.
August 3rd in the morning. As soon as daylight appeared, the enemy were seen coming from behind a point on the west side of the lake, stretching their line of floats, bateaux, and bark canoes almost across.
Our artillery, placed on some platforms which were borne on boats fastened together, led the way. In passing the point of land which had concealed us from the view of the enemy, they took care to salute the fort by a general discharge.
Fort William Henry was stirred into action. The British and colonials frantically prepared for the attack. Livestock was secured, and the New England forces were sent out to burn huts and hedges to the west of the fort, clearing the approaches.
They seemed to have been not in the least expecting a siege, though I cannot imagine from what source their confidence arose.
At Fort Edward to the south, they heard the cannon fire coming from Lake George. General Webb immediately sent letters to Albany requesting more troops.
They have fired the signals of the approach of the enemy at Fort William Henry. The General therefore desires you will do everything in your power to forward the raising of the militia.
Back at Lake George, the French boats continued their approach, landing on the western shore, a few miles north of the fort.
Upon the enemy's landing, Colonel Monroe sent 100 of the Massachusetts forces to get into the road leading to Fort Edward.
The British colonials almost immediately encountered the 1,800 French allied Indians.
Okay, just to jump in here, one of the things you got to realize that when they're talking British, this is pre-American Revolution. So those British soldiers were all part of the colonies, and the French were part of New France, and they're coming down from what is now Canada. So if you've seen movies like The Patriot, and if you remember the father who had lost his son, played by Mel Gibson, he fought as a British soldier during this period, and it was extremely violent. And as we get into this a little bit more here, you'll see exactly how violent it ended up. And even though the civilized portions of the battle were the French and the English, and they tried to work things out, there was a little bit more into the mixture that they didn't expect, and it turned out a lot worse than they thought it would. So keep an eye out for that.
They retreated back into the camp with 18 killed and several more wounded. While the French boats had been approaching, the Chevalier de Lévis with his detachment led by the Indians had traveled by land. They marched for miles through thick forest and mountains. Now they took up post in the trees south of the fort.
Upon Captain Saltonstall's retreat, the enemy got almost round us and made a continual fire with their small arms, which we returned, and likewise with grape shot from our 12-pounders, which took good effect on the Indians.
While the Indians engaged the fort, Montcalm's remaining forces set up camp on the western edge of the lake. In the early afternoon, the French had a flag of truce flown. They used a red flag as the flag of New France was white. Montcalm sent a message to Colonel Monroe, asking for the surrender of the fort. In his letter, he referenced the ferocity of the Indians as a means of persuasion.
Sir, I have this morning invested your place with a numerous army, the superior artillery, and all the savages from the higher parts of the country, the cruelty of which a detachment of your garrison have lately too much experience. I am obliged in humanity to desire you to surrender your fort.
During this parley, the Indians surrounded the fort in a display of force.
An Abenaki speaking bad French shouted, "You won't surrender? Then take care to defend yourself. For if I capture you, you will get no quarter."
The presence of these French allied Indians created a lot of fear in the minds of the English because of the raids on the frontier for the previous 70 or 80 years.
I think a lot of the men that fought that battle were probably pretty scared. If you're a young man, never seeing what a Native American looked like, all painted in war paint and so on, that's going to frighten you.
The British were resolute in their response to Montcalm.
Colonel Monroe returned for answer that while one log of the fort remained upon another, or he had a man to fight, he would defend it.
The haughtiness of this answer was shortly afterwards published amidst the roar of a general discharge of the enemy's artillery.
As soon as the parley was over, the fighting resumed. The British continued bombarding the French, trying to disrupt the building of their entrenchments.
The remainder of the day was spent in a constant fire upon us from the enemy's musketry, and as constant fire from the fort, with cannons and shells.
As night approached, Colonel Monroe wrote to General Webb at Fort Edward, asking for reinforcements. He in turn received a letter from Webb.
This place was so suddenly surrounded by the enemy that there was no sending off an express. Captain Ogden has 3 letters of mine to you. They have not yet erected their batteries, but the Indians have been firing upon us from the woods all day. I make no doubt that you will soon send us a reinforcement.
We have just fired the 2-minute guns repeated each quarter of an hour to show we know your situation. The General doubts not, but everything will be done for the best on yours and Colonel Young's part, and is determined to assist you as soon as possible with the whole army if required.
While the British awaited reinforcements from Fort Edward, the French army worked through the night to establish their position.
The enemy, we found, had been busy all the last night in throwing up an entrenchment and bringing up stores, which, for want of men, we could not prevent, but annoyed them as much as possible from the fort by continual fire from our cannons and mortars.
With the sunrise, the fighting continued in earnest.
This day we had continual skirmishes with the savages in the woods, and annoyed the enemy as much as we could with our cannon from the fort and camp.
The Indians around the encampment kept the British and colonials pinned down, even threatening the fort's water source.
The activity and bravery of the Indians increased the number of prisoners, that is to say, of those who were doomed to misery. It was not possible for the enemy to steer a single step from the place, without exposing themselves either to captivity or death. So much were the Indians on the alert.
As the Indians engaged the English, the French soldiers continued work on their entrenchment. The fort maintained a heavy fire on them while they worked.
To see the joy with which they transported to the trench the fascines and gabions, you would have taken them for persons invulnerable to the active and continual fire of the enemy.
Constant fire on the trenches by the British did little to dissuade the French.
French did a good
The
job.
main result was wear on their artillery.
This day we had the misfortune to burst a mortar, but hurt nobody, or but slightly.
At Fort Edward, General Webb continued sending requests for reinforcements from Albany and the neighboring colonies. A Canadian prisoner had told Webb that the French had a force 11,000 strong. Based on this false information, he did not feel he had the manpower to aid the men at Fort William Henry, or even defend New York. General Webb also sent a reply to Colonel Monroe's messages from the day before. This letter would not reach Fort William Henry for several days. Webb's couriers were intercepted on the road from Fort Edward.
Connectagon ran into 3 men, one of whom was captured, one killed, and the third escaped. He brought back the prisoner and the jacket of the dead man. In the lining, we found a letter dated the 4th at midnight.
Hundreds of French troops worked through the night on the trenches, the 1st Battery, and a communication trench for the 2nd Battery. In the morning, the fighting resumed. The Indians kept up their musket fire, with many entering the cleared area around Fort William Henry. The men inside returned fire and suffered the loss of more cannons.
The whole day we kept a constant fire from the fort on the enemy's works. I had the misfortune to burst 2 32-pounders and 1 18-pounder. The Indians all the while annoying us all in their power with their small arms.
As the siege progressed, the Indians grew impatient with the French. They felt they alone had engaged in the battle up to this point. They wanted to see the cannons fired and the French join the fight.
All the Indian tribes began to grow weary on account of the silence of our great guns, as they called our cannon. They did not wish longer to take upon themselves the whole burden of the war.
Montcalm summoned a council at 5 in the evening. He shared with the Indians the captured letter from General Webb. He told them his plan of attack and informed them that the cannons would fire in the morning.
At 6 in the morning, the left battery, which is 8 pieces of cannon, begin to shoot.
They gave us 2 guns, and soon after, 7 more, very quick, one after the other, which hot fire they continued all day.
The French found their mark quickly. The men in Fort William Henry had to endure the onslaught of the French artillery.
They got their distance very well, several of their small shells falling into the parade. One of their shot carried away the pulley of our flag staff, and the falling of our flag much rejoiced the enemy. But it was soon hoisted, though one of the men that was doing this had his head shot off with a ball.
With each successful blow from the French cannons, the Indians shouted in approval.
Such were the cries of joy that all the mountains resounded with the echoes. During the whole course of the siege, it was never necessary to make any great movement to learn the success of our artillery. The cries of the Indians at any time carried the intelligence to all parts of our camp.
To the shock of the men in the encampment, they recognized the British Royal Mark on some of the cannonballs. These were most likely taken at Oswego the previous year. As the French bombarded the fort, the Indians yet again advanced on the encampment. Colonel Monroe sent out a group of New England forces to meet them. They were soon overwhelmed and forced back. The cannons in the encampment were then brought to bear to disperse the attackers.
Here an unlucky accident happened, as some of our men returning to camp were taken for the enemy and fired upon, by which several were killed and wounded.
Montcalm's forces were having great effect. Both the Indians and the 1st Battery were wearing down the fort and camp.
Several of our men were this day wounded in the camp, one of whom had his thigh shot off by an 18-pounder as he was standing sentry, the ball going through a corner of the tent which tore it to pieces.
Throughout the day, the fort itself took minimal damage, but lost several more cannons. Colonel Monroe detailed the losses in a letter to General Webb at Fort Edward.
As proof of the insufficiency of the artillery, we have had within 24 hours 2 10-pounders, 1 12-pounder, and 1 mortar burst. We have been obliged to give 2 12-pounders from the camp, which we could very ill spare.
In a separate letter, Monroe again expressed the needs for reinforcements and the desperate situation at Lake George. As the men at Fort William Henry waited for relief, reinforcements began to arrive at Fort Edward. General Webb appeared timid or indecisive.
You can well imagine how much firing went on with those cannons to have them split. It just boggles the imagination. And of course, with the consistent firepower from both the natives and the French, they had no choice but to continually fire those cannons. So they're not only probably running low on ammunition, but the wear and tear on their big guns was pretty impressive.
In his actions.
By the 4th day of the siege, there were roughly 2,000 militia that had arrived at Fort Edward that could have moved north to try to break the siege. They may not have been successful, and that was probably a concern of Webb, that he would risk being in a position where those forces could be defeated, and if Montcalm intended to advance, Fort Edward would certainly fall.
Whatever his reasons, Webb did not march to Fort William Henry. The men at Lake George were left to fend for themselves. This day the siege had begun in earnest. Nightfall did little to ease the assault on Fort William Henry.
The bombardment continued on both sides the whole succeeding night, at about a quarter of an hour's time between the throwing of each shell.
While their cannons attacked the fort, the French soldiers continued their siege works under the cover of darkness.
In the morning of the 7th, the firing began with great briskness, continuing so till 10 o'clock in the forenoon, when another flag of truce appeared from the French.
Montcalm sent his aide-de-camp to deliver General Webb's letter, which was intercepted on the 5th. He felt assured that this letter would demonstrate the futility of continuing the defense of Fort William Henry.
I'm directed by General Webb to acknowledge the receipt of 3 of your letters. He has ordered me to acquaint you he does not think it prudent, as you know his strength at this place, to attempt a junction, or to assist you till reinforced by the militia of the colonies. The General thought proper to give you this intelligence, that in case he should be so unfortunate from the delays of the militia not to have in his power to give you timely assistance, you might be able to make the best terms left in your power.
We can only imagine what Colonel Monroe must have felt when he read General Webb's letter. The letter did not bring the results Montcalm had hoped for. Colonel Monroe and his officers held fast.
This letter had not the effect Montcalm proposed to himself, and indeed it was surprising to see a handful of men with all hopes of success cut off behave with so much resolution as they afterwards did.
Throughout the day, the siege continued intensely. The French artillery repeatedly found its mark. Shells landed on the bastions and in the parade grounds. One shell burst in the barracks, wounding Captain Ormsby, the ranking officer at the fort. To make matters worse, more British cannons burst.
Wow.
It appears these losses, as well as Webb's letter, caused a loss of morale in the troops.
This day the enemy fired several shots at the encampment, which killed and wounded many. At night, 2 of the regulars deserted.
Fear had spread among the besieged, so that they no longer acted as soldiers, except by giving them ardent spirits.
Monroe showed zero tolerance for cowardice or desertion.
This day, Colonel Monroe published his orders to all in the fort that if any person proved cowardly or offered to advise giving up the fort, that he should be immediately hanged over the walls. He was determined to stand it out to the last, or as long as 2 legs were together.
The situation of Fort William Henry grew steadily worse. The French advanced their siege works almost with indifference to the musket and cannon fire from the fort. By the morning of August 8th, they advanced their trenches across a small marsh toward the fort's garden, continuing their work into the day.
The garden was
The
large.
British and provincials fought on the best they could. They continued engaging the Canadians and Indians surrounding the encampment and returned cannon fire with what little artillery they had remaining.
We kept skirmishing all day as customary, and annoying them as much as lay in our power.
The situation became increasingly desperate. The French cannons had easily found their range on both the fort and camp. All the while, the French troops diligently pressed the siege works forward.
This night we came out of the march. It is from this parallel that we established the breaching batteries. This work was well advanced in the night, even despite the fire in the fort, which had never before been so lively.
As the French army pressed on with their trench at the back of the fort's garden, the British took honest stock of their situation.
In the evening, an engineer was sent to examine the condition of the fort, who found From the state of the artillery, ammunition, and other stores, it was no longer tenable. Besides, the men had been without rest 5 nights and were almost stupefied.
Early in the morning, on August 9th, 1757, Colonel Monroe called a council of war with all the officers of the fort and camp. The situation was dire. The French completed their work at the back of the garden.
The next morning, the French were very near neighbors, having brought their approaches within about 100 yards of the fort.
In addition to the approach of the French trenches, the British suffered the loss of yet more cannons.
Early this morning, we had the misfortune to burst another mortar, so that we had only left in the fort fit for use 2 6-pounders, 1 9-pounder, 2 4-pounders, 1 7-inch mortar, and 1 7-inch howitzer, with very few shot and shells that were fit for them.
Monroe's Council of War deliberated the state of affairs. The French advances, along with the condition of the artillery, must have made the decision apparent to them.
Upon a representation to George Monroe by several officers commanding corps in this camp, they were of the opinion nothing further could be done for the defense of Fort William Henry.
At 7 in the morning, the fort raised the white flag and asked to capitulate.
Lieutenant Colonel Young was sent to the French camp to negotiate.
And so begins the real tragedy in this documentary. I mean, they went through hell up to this point, but this is the part that's really shocking.
Negotiate the terms of surrender. The articles of capitulation were drawn up. They stated, the troops of the fort and camp would march out with the honors of war, colors flying. The men would keep their belongings and be escorted to Fort Edward by a French detachment. The fort would be handed over immediately, and the encampment after the British troops depart. All of the artillery and military stores shall be delivered to the French. The troops at Fort William Henry will not fight in the war for 18 months. All French, Canadian, and Indian prisoners will be returned to Fort Carillon within 3 months. A British officer shall be given as a hostage until the French detachment sent as escort returns. All sick and wounded will remain under the care of the Marquis de Montcalm and be returned when they have recovered. Provisions for the safety of the British troops are valid only for today and tomorrow. And finally, as a show of respect for the brave defense of the fort, the British can march to Fort Edward with 1 piece of cannon.
Sounds fair, doesn't it?
Before signing the capitulation, the Marquis de Montcalm assembled a council with the chiefs of all the nations.
He informed them of the articles granted the besieged, and the motives which determined he granted them. He asked their consent, and their word that their young people would not make any disorder. The chiefs have agreed to everything, and promised to contain their young people.
Around midday, the capitulation was signed. Almost immediately, the Indians and Canadians surrounded the fort, eager to obtain the spoils of war which were promised for their participation in this campaign.
The Indians did not delay to strike their blow. They penetrated into the place in crowds through the embrasures of the cannon for the purpose of proceeding to the pillage, which it had been agreed to give up to them.
The Indians swarmed through the fort, taking what rewards they could. As the garrison in the fort moved to the camp, the Indians turned their attention there, unhappy that the British were allowed to keep their belongings.
The English troops were to remain in their entrenched camp until the next day. Despite a guard from our troops, the Indians could not be stopped from entering and pillaging.
They were all this day very troublesome, stealing the baggage of the officers and whatever they could lay their hands on.
Everything was done to stop them. We will be most fortunate if we can avoid a massacre.
By nightfall, order was finally restored in the encampment. To prevent any further trouble, it was decided that the British should march to Fort Edward that night. This order was quickly rescinded when it was discovered that many of the Indians were not in their camp.
The savages, not satisfied with the plunder that they had got in the morning, intended to attack us on our march. It was more advisable we should remain until the morning.
The men in the encampment spent a disagreeable night under the protection of 100 French regulars. The following morning, the British and provincials eagerly prepared for their departure. They found the Indians had not lost interest in them during the night.
Early this morning, we were ordered to prepare for our march, but found the Indians in a worse temper, if possible, than last night. Every one having a tomahawk, hatchet, or some other instrument of death.
The Indians flocked around the encampment, climbed over the breastwork, and moved about the camp in a menacing display. They demanded the British turn over their valuables.
These demands were made in a tone which announced that the thrust of the spear would be the price of a refusal.
The British implored the French guards for help.
At all events, the French troops who we thought were sent to protect us were of no assistance, and advised giving up our effects rather than dispute with the savages.
The men threw down their possessions, hoping to abate the anger of the Indians, without success. They continued to strip the British, taking hats, swords, and clothing, leaving many naked and confusion to overrun the encampment. Then they turned to the hospital tents.
The Indian doctors began with their tomahawks to cure the sick and the wounded.
The horrid cruelties committed upon these unhappy wretches before our faces terrified us to the greatest degree imaginable.
As the pillaging and slaughter went on in the encampment, the British regulars finally began their march.
At last, with great difficulty, the troops got from the retrenchment, but they were no sooner out than the savages fell upon the rear, killing and scalping.
Woe to those who closed the march, or to the stragglers whom illness or any other reason separated ever so little from the main body. They were as good as dead, and their lifeless bodies soon strewed the ground.
The sound of the attack at the rear caused confusion at the front of the line, causing the march to halt. Once the men in the front realized the attack, they began hurriedly marching again, only adding to the turmoil.
They discharged right and left heavy blows with their hatchets on those who came within their reach.
The terrified British and provincials fled the encampment.
A crowd of unhappy beings running about at random, some towards the woods, others towards the tents of the French, these towards the fort, those towards places which seemed to promise them an asylum. Such were the pitiable objects which presented themselves to my eyes.
The Indians pursued, tearing the children from their mothers' bosoms and their mothers from their husbands, then singling out the men, carrying them in the woods and killing a great many whom we saw lying on the roadside.
This horrid scene of blood and slaughter obliged our officers to apply to the officers of the French Guard for protection, which they refused, and told them they must take to the woods and shift for themselves.
The French were not by any means indolent spectators, or insensible to this catastrophe. The Chevalier de Lévis ran in all directions where the tumult seemed most violent. The French and Canadian officers imitated his example.
The French, it is true, had a detachment of their men drawn up, as is mentioned in the capitulation, but their only business was to receive the plunder by the savages.
What avail were 400 men against about 1,500 furious Indians who could scarcely distinguish us from the enemy? One of our sergeants, who had opposed himself bravely to their violence, was struck to the earth by the blow of a spear.
The chaos surrounding the march from the encampment caused much confusion. Men, women, and children were carried off as prisoners. Some were stripped of their clothing and belongings, while others fled for their safety.
The Indians followed above halfway to Fort Edward, and most of the officers and many of the soldiers chose to remain with the French for protection.
As the British fled and the French intervened on their behalf, the Indian attack came to an end. The attack only lasted a few minutes, But the swiftness and frenzy of the day's events have come to overshadow the 6 days of the siege.
The number killed during the siege did not exceed 80, of which 10 were killed in the fort. The number killed on the road to Fort Edward is uncertain, as many were butchered in the woods and bushes. Near 30 carcasses, however, were actually seen, and from the frequent stenches they met, had reason to imagine many more lay scattered about.
By the night of August 10th, only a few hundred men had reached the safety of Fort Edward, with more straggling in over the next few days. The accounts of the massacre from this first handful of troops caused the casualty numbers to be greatly inflated. Initial reports put the number killed as high as 1,500. Modern studies estimate the number to be closer to 270. The French burned Fort William Henry on August 14th. On the 15th, they returned the British prisoners that they had secured from the Indians. More prisoners would later be purchased from the Indians in Montreal. The events at Fort William Henry were widely publicized and used by the English as propaganda, both to recruit provincial soldiers for the war and to demonize the French and Native Americans. In the years since the siege, the story found new life through accounts told in periodicals and novels such as The Last of the Mohicans, many of these distorting the actual events. The surviving journals of the men who were there paint an engaging picture of the events, but also contain many discrepancies and omissions. By comparing the various written accounts from the French and British sides, we can piece together much of the story. Sadly, the perspective we are missing is from the Native Americans.
Eric Swanson did a beautiful job on this documentary. And if you get a chance, check out his YouTube channel, Eric K. Swanson. Amazing stuff that he has on there. Just absolutely amazing. Wow. That was something to see. And it actually, to see how violent it was back then, you just have to shake your head. But my goodness. I well imagine, too, that during the course of doing the archaeological digs, they must have found a lot of things there. I wish I had my metal detector down that area, because I would imagine they would have found quite a bit. But that was a good one to share with you all, so that you knew what went on at Fort William Henry. So that one I'm glad I got a chance to share. So I'll give a few minutes here to anybody who wants to come up and chit chat with me and share your perspectives on it. Putting the link there for coming up on the live. But my goodness, I just got to shake my head. That was amazing. So now that I've taken a good look at that, the coinage and the collectibles I have there, I wouldn't even know where to start. It's just blows my mind seeing this sort of thing, and seeing the things that especially our friends down in the US, they collect a great deal down there. And I would imagine that they found quite a bit of artifacts that would be great in a collection or even in a museum. So yeah, Wow, I am absolutely gobsmacked. So that was fun. And now it's that time of day where I can start looking at, collecting all the loose ends that I need for my collection. Right now, I'm working on my Canadian quarter collection. Every once in a while, it's a good idea to take a look at your collection to see the state of your coins and the state of whether you have some empty spots you want to fill. And every once in a while, you'll even find one like I did, where I had to replace a 1965 quarter. It was in the slot for 1966. Those are silver, so I had to go out and get myself a 1966 quarter to fill the slot. And I also went out and picked up. Actually, they're on the way here. Some 50-cent pieces that I was missing for my collection. So over the course of the summer, that's the sort of thing I do. If I'm not doing that, I'm out trying to get some fresh air and doing a little bit of metal detecting, and hopefully come up with a few items. How many of you out there have been doing your thing and building on your collection, or doing some metal detecting or gold panning? I'm curious to hear. Oh, that's nice to hear. Yeah, it's always nice to find those. Yeah. Yeah, I'm still collecting. These are the ones that oh, it looks terrible on here because it disappears. Yeah, I have a tray that's actually magnetic. It's used for auto parts, screws and stuff. But at a very quick moment, I can tell what's silver and what's not silver. But I can go through every time I get change. I'll throw it in here, and when I get a chance, I'll run through it like, okay, there's one right there. My goodness, isn't that something? Okay, that's a commemorative. I got, don't know if you'll be able to see that very well because of the. I'm gonna get rid of my backdrop so that you can see it a little bit better here. Hold on. Boom, there I'm back. Okay. So yeah, that's one I found in my change. That was upside down. There we go. Yeah, I just came from the post office side to get some U.S. and international stamps and a few more envelopes for folks that have been doing such a fabulous job of doing the competition I'm hosting at the moment. In reference to that competition, it's soon coming to a close, and once it closes, and I'm going to do a little bit of promoting here. Go back to the beginning of this last session and do some research and put your information in there, because you still have an opportunity to win a 5-ounce copper round. That's actually, they're quite nice. The last person that got one received one that was had the Aztec theme. This next one, I believe, is the Indian head and or a buffalo. I can't remember which one now, but you can win yourself a 5-ounce round. Once that's done, I will be doing postings on coinage similar to what the contestants were doing, and what Nick Molnar has done is I'm going to be putting the information down on it just for your sake, for reference. And I'll be doing a live feed, hopefully, with my friend Dale and maybe even Roman from Austrian Stacker. And we're going to get to our live feeds going on a regular basis. I've just been waiting for Dale to finish his move been a long haul for him. He's been working diligently to get resettled in a nicer community. And I know he's going through withdrawals because his collection's stored somewhere else. So he's got nothing. Can you imagine that? You've got your whole collection packed away, and you don't even have internet. It's like going back into the 1970s, for Pete's sake. Oh my goodness. So yeah. So with that, we'll do probably do a little bit of metal detecting today. I'm also planning on going out with Marlon from Mare Videos and my friend Bill, and we're going to do some metal detecting in the next couple of days. So it should be a lot of fun. I'll try to get some video on that as well. So I haven't got anybody that wants to come up. I'm going to do my thing here and wander off and get a few things done around the house. I just want to say thank you very much for hanging out with me for a little over an hour here today. I know, I hope you enjoy the history as much as I do. And next week we'll have one more rendition of Canadian history, and actually it's more North American history, because we weren't formed as Canada yet. But I love bringing this out, and you can actually see some of the stuff you rarely see or hear about. And this information is mind-boggling. It also gives you an insight as to, if you were in the areas where a lot of these events took place, it's a good chance, if you had a permission or you had some areas where you can do some metal detecting, you could find some really interesting finds. It's part of our history and part of doing a little bit of amateur archaeology. That's super. So with that, thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you guys out there. I'll try to visit every one of your channels when I can, and by all means, keep visiting me here on the Numismaniac channel, and we will catch you at another time. Take care, everybody.